Welcome everyone to our first ever Branching Minds MTSS Professional Learning Retreat. My name is Britt Shirley. I'm the Director of Professional Learning here at Branching Minds. It is my pleasure to welcome you and kick off our retreat today, and I'm so excited to be spending this summertime with you. Before we get started, I wanted to note that we have over 850 educators registered for today's event. That is an amazing number of educators ready to spend their summer with us. If you ever feel alone in trying to advance your MTSS practices or to support students, know that you have a web of educators that are doing the same thing and ready to support you. Let this be a reminder that Branching Minds is also here to support you, as our professional services team and our marketing department push out content as often as we can to support you through your changing needs. We are thrilled to be able to learn with you today and alongside you. Before we dive into our first session, I wanted to answer this question that is the most anticipated question of the day. Will this session be recorded? Everything today will be recorded and shared with you tomorrow morning, so don't worry. Also, if you have any questions throughout the day today, please use the chat box, as there may not always be time for Q&A at the end of the sessions, but we're happy to engage with you in the chat box and make sure that we're sharing responses. My colleague Maureen from the marketing department will be on after this chat that we have this morning, and she'll review some of the logistics for the rest of the day with you. I'm going to go ahead and get ready to kick off our Poolside chat with my friend, Dr. Jose Castillo. Jose is the Associate Professor at the University of South Florida and Director for the Institute of School Community Partnerships. Jose and I go back to my days as a district administrator, where I was focused on improving systemic MTSS practices. Today, Jose and I are excited to unpack the self-assessment best practices, reduce your fear and haste if you have to complete an MTSS self-assessment, and help you understand and see the how and why behind engaging in self-assessments. Hint, it's just like what we ask our students to do when we engage in self-assessment practices. Let me just check backstage and make sure that Jose is here and ready, and we'll bring him on. Hey there, Jose, happy summer.
Hey.
Welcome to our Poolside chat. I'm so happy to have you here today. Do you have any summer plans coming up? First, let me just, what's the most important question? Do you have any summer plans?
Yeah, I do, Brittany. Hey, it's good to see you again. My son actually is on a travel baseball team, so I'll be traveling from my home state of Florida to South Carolina to watch him play and support him for a week in Myrtle Beach. Never been before, so I'm pretty excited about that. Otherwise, my wife and I have a 6-month-old at home, so the rest of the summer will be tending to her, making sure she's happy and well fed and rested and all of that kind of stuff. But we're not the type of people that are going to attempt to pull off traveling with a 6-month-old. We're content being at home and just sticking with the routine. So
I can totally understand that. And congratulations to you and your growing family, and good luck to your son at baseball. So we're excited for that. Okay, Jose, here we are. We're closing out the school year, and it has been so exciting to talk about MTSS self-assessments and kind of put this spin on it of that, question that we hear pretty often that we may or may not be so fond of is this graded, right? It's like the teacher dreaded question that every student wants to say. And I'm not sure if it's because it's ingrained in us as learners or educators, but it's that fear, right? That fear of being graded or the haste to get things done, that sometimes we miss that growth, that mindset or continuous improvement challenge that might be presented to us. And so I'm so excited to be here with you today to talk more about the MTSS self-assessment and that mindset shift that we can relate back to what we hear as teachers, right? So I don't want to spend too much time giving all the details away of everything that we can talk about today, so we can dive right in. See how I did that there for us? Yeah. All right, well, let's dive right in. Jose, can you just give me a better picture? Can you help us get started today with just sharing a little bit about what is an MTSS self-assessment? Why should we care about it? Why do we do it? Who does it? some of the details.
Love to. One of my favorite topics to talk about. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to have this conversation with you today. For me, when I think about an MTSS self-assessment, I really go back to what you talked about with a growth mindset. It's really an opportunity for us to take a look at our MTSS, our multi-tiered systems of support, and that system being the key word. It's a really big thing, right? It's not a set of just procedures. It's not a process with a start or an end. It's a continuous framework for improving outcomes for students, for creating access and opportunity for more equitable outcomes for students. And in order to do that, we have to take a look at everything we do. And I don't know about you, Brittany, but when I think about that, it gives me pause. It's a little bit scary to think about how big that can be. So the self-assessment really gives you the opportunity to break down your MTSS or multi-tiered system of support into the various components that are important to think about, have conversations around, identify where you're at, and plan for what you're going to do next in those areas, so you can move from wherever you're at with your MTSS. And schools across the country are in very different places, from restarting their approach to knocking a lot of it out of the park. Again, going with the baseball, getting ready for my son's trip, in case you can't tell. And everywhere in between. And so what it really allows you to do is take stock, plan, come back, take stock again later, plan some more, just like we do with the students in our school. Like if you think about the crux of an MTSS, it's about growth. We assess, we inform instruction intervention, we assess again, we replan with our instruction intervention. So it's that same continuous improvement idea.
Yeah, I love hearing that. It's funny, right at the end of the year, my son was working on an end of the year project, and he came home and he told me it was the end of the year and he wasn't super into it. So he's like, I just want to hit this row of the rubric. So we read up to the rubric to see all the things that he needed to do. And then he realized oh, you know what, if I just do this one more thing, I could move to the next lane on the rubric. And I think that's what we want to work through when we're working on those self-assessments, right? What do we need to do to get here? What are the things in this row that are a little bit different? How can we extend and see what little of each section, right? He had his rating section, his grammar section, his details, and then the overall storyline. So it's pretty similar, right? Just like the students do their rubric. That's what we're doing too.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think writing is a great analogy, because writing's complex. It's really hard to sort of nail down everything into one score or one component. You got to look at it in its whole and its parts, and the journey to get to becoming a good writer. So I love that analogy.
Yeah, that was this little thing. Yeah. All right. So you struck a chord with me a little bit when we talked about it being scary. It is. I mean, you and I work with some schools, some educators, right? And it's even so scary, MTSS is this huge strategic initiative framework for schools to utilize. So what are the fears? Let's just name it to tame it today. I think that would be super helpful. What are some of the fears that you hear districts or school leaders or the school teams talking about when they're completing the MTSS self-assessment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think there are a few that we hear very commonly, across the nation. I think one relates to it being overwhelming, just the sheer scope of it. That's something I can appreciate. Sometimes when we have this big thing we're working towards, you can get paralyzed, through just not knowing where to start and not knowing what the next steps are. But I tend to think about it as that old expression, Rome wasn't built in a day. Just like we're talking about a framework for everything that we do, we're not going to build our MTSS to where we want it to be in a day. So if we have a way, and if you think about the building of Rome or any other building or city, there's a blueprint that you have, and that blueprint gives you ideas and directions for where to start. And you coordinate with the other people who are going to be involved in the building, and you come up with a plan. There's some directions, they get going. well, you have to calibrate along the way because something doesn't go right. Some parts are missing. You realize that something in the blueprint didn't work quite like you thought it was going to, and you have to stop, you have to reassess, and you have to make adjustments to the plant. And, so to get just like Rome, I think that when we're talking about building our MTSS, getting into that mindset that it's not something we're going to be able to put on paper, fully understand in one day and then implement in one day and be done with it, and everybody know what we're doing. It's almost like we have to embrace the challenge and the struggle as something that is going to be difficult. But if we are willing to approach it and to tackle it, then we know from research and from evidence and practice that we're going to improve outcomes for students. So I think that's definitely one.
I think about that overwhelm a lot and just the sheer like beast of MTSS, but sometimes too that overwhelm and just like jargon, right? I think when you and I first met years ago, I think that I still was learning about assessment types, like just understanding the difference between like universal screening and then progress monitoring, right? So like that can be overwhelming and also a little intimidating, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when you're faced with, and I don't mean faced with, but when you have students walking in the door and you're trying to deliver instruction, you're trying to interview and necessarily try to collect your assessment data and make decisions, it can be difficult to think through, well, when and where am I going to find the time? And that's sort of the second thing we often hear. When and where am I going to find the time to stop, to pause, and to have these conversations around the things that are on our self-assessment so that we can identify what in those practices that we're engaging in are going well and where we need to calibrate and make some improvements.
Yeah, the time is a big one, isn't it? It's like I'm going to self-assess and spend the time doing that. And then do I have enough time after I self-assess to even improve on some of these things? And I think time is one of those funny things. If you don't spend the time up front, I think the students, everything will make you spend the time on it in the future, right? Like it just comes down the line. It still costs you time some way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Prior to my current role, I was a school psychologist in a local school district. And my supervisor at the time had this expression that really stuck with me when we were working with schools to help support their MTSS. And she used to tell like the leaders at the schools, the leadership teams, sometimes you got to start slow to go fast, meaning that yes, there's this pressure that we feel. Yes, there are statutes and regulations and policies that require some of these things, but we have an opportunity to get it right. And sometimes that means we have to carve out the time from the time that we have in order to really be planful. And if we do that, to your point, Brittany, we're going to save some time on the back end.
Yeah. That's I think we hear that so often. There's like a great visualization about that, right? Like the ladder rungs, like if you can't take those huge steps, you got to make sure that you're spending time putting all the little steps in between that really, really matter. Yeah. I love it. So you just mentioned a leader that you had in the past, and leadership is not only a huge component of one of the parts of an MTSS, but we know that they're the driving force in helping launch these self-assessments at times. They're a big force in ensuring that we're steering the ship in the right direction as we implement and adjust our MTSS sales. How scary is it for leaders to really, really reflect on practice? And especially when they may be struggling with different things, or maybe there's just a fear of like exposing areas of strength and weakness. Is that a fear that you see often?
Yes. And I've seen various approaches to it. Sometimes I've also seen where leaders, come in and say, look, we have a job to do here. We need to improve outcomes for our students, and we're all going to be vulnerable and have these courageous conversations. And that includes me. And I think when I've seen that approach is where we see the most success in the use of these MTSS self-assessments, because they all typically come with some kind of score you get as you're rating the different components of what you're implementing. Some focus just on the practices. Others include like the what the leadership teams need to do to plan and support teachers, capacity building, professional learning, all that kind of stuff. But regardless of what you're actually completing, when a leader sets the tone for that, the scores that you get are information that can be useful, but to me, the conversations that you have that are open, they're honest, and you're bringing together the perspectives of the different people who interface with your school or your district system in different ways and see things because of that others may not see, really helps build a more shared understanding of what's going on, what the strengths are to celebrate, and where we need to go next to improve our MTSS. On the flip side, and I think this is, I kind of answered the positive side of the question. Now the more, I don't know, negative or things that I see that is not as challenge or as useful is when leaders walk in and they're either worried about what their boss is going to say at the district level because they're worried about them being graded and how they're going to be viewed. Or sometimes I've seen it, they don't want to, for whatever reason, sort of be vulnerable in front of their staff and show that things aren't going the way that everybody wants to see. There's this subtle or sometimes very explicit pressure on the folks that are having those conversations and completing this self-assessment to cast things in a more positive light than is really occurring, which leads to higher ratings, but it's not going to improve wherever you're at with your MTSS. And I'll just give you one example from my time as a school psychologist in a school I was supporting. So I was facilitating an MTSS self-assessment, doesn't matter which one it was. And for the first part of the meeting, and this was early on in my time at the school, our leadership team was meeting and we had special educator representative around the table, teacher representative, student services personnel. So I was a school psychologist, school counselor, for example, and the assistant principal in the room. The principal was not at the beginning of the meeting. So for the first, 5 or 6 items, we were having what I thought were great conversations about what was happening, where we were doing well, where we needed to do more to help support and empower teachers in the building to understand why we were doing what this is, how it relates to what they do in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. And we had some things that we rated highly. We had some things we got to do some work in this area. After that 5th or 6th item, the principal walked in the room. And I'm not exaggerating this at all, Brittany. Every rating from that point on was a 3, and 3 was the highest on the scale.
Score.
And the amount of conversation that occurred around each rating also went to almost 0. And I think it was because it was not a safe space for the folks on that team to share their perspectives of what was really going on, because for whatever reason, it was important to cast the school in a good light, when the administrator was in the room or the principal in this instance. And that really, to me, was a wasted opportunity, not just about the ratings again, but for those conversations to happen that really help people who are leading the growth in their MTSS to get on the same page about what's going well and what can be improved and what we can do about it as a group.
Yeah, I've had a lot of similar experiences to that, different fears, within our MTSS. So many roles across our campuses have put procedures in place, have put practices in place, have developed a form for this or, something here. And it almost feels like a little bit of judgment on how did that work? Or if not everyone at the table knew about that form. I think those are insightful conversations, right? That means that maybe we're not just as advanced as we thought, or this is an area for growth, which is really a good thing. So we're going to have to come back next year. And so I'd hate to just keep always doing the same thing, right? It's always a little next to grow. But I think that feeling of judgment makes it sensitive. And that comes from, going back to the kids in the rubric, right? Like we've kind of learned that as students our whole lives, and now we're at big time educators,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We have this, well, now we're on the other side and we're the givers of the rubric, but in
Yeah.
this case, to the learner seat. And we put on that, I think that again, that's like, gosh, it's graded. I got to make sure it's the best.
Yeah.
Or we just got to get it done and just mark the highest answer because that's what the teacher or the district might want to see, or whoever's looking at this. Really, like what I hear you saying is that, yeah, I mean, you're probably going to have to turn it into your district, but it's about your score. It's about where you're coming from and where you're heading toward, how you're going to grow.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that idea of growth, and I think as educators, embracing the growth mindset we want our children and youth to embrace, our students is critical. And you reminded me as I was listening to you, Brittany, of another colleague that I have who, prior to, working with me at USF, was a kindergarten teacher for 10 years. And early on in my career, I remember being a school psychologist who was trained in a school psych program that poured the MTSS Kool-Aid, and I drank it up and thought it was the best like tasting Kool-Aid, like mama had made it, like for us sitting by the pool for this poolside chat. It was the best thing I'd ever had. I, grew up in the MTSS world. As a young school psychologist, it took me a little bit to understand, first of all, why isn't everybody else like the Kool-Aid as much as I do? And then realizing there are some legitimate challenges and things we have to work through and talk through, but also understanding where a lot of educators are coming from. And this is where my colleague ties in, I promise. So
Okay, it's okay.
she said to me at one point, well, Jose, like one of the things that I always remember having, in my role as a teacher, being an educator is tied up not just in who we are as a professional, but who we are as a person. It's part of our identity that you just can't separate. And so when you are coming to people and saying, we can do better, look what these data say, or we're not doing everything perfectly, X, Y, and Z isn't working out or is wrong, or whatever language you use, many educators, what they're hearing is, oh, I'm not doing the best I can for my students, I'm doing harm. And then again, that's not just impacting them who they are as a professional, but who they are as a person. And it was when I listened to her and really reflected on what she said that I was like, oh wow, okay, it's okay that not everybody likes the Kool-Aid, and there's a lot of there's legitimate like reasons that I can't understand, not having been a teacher myself. And I need to do a better job listening, talking with them, and having those courageous conversations and figuring out how we can find a place where we can all move forward, because there is that idea of a growth mindset that we want to instill in folks, and not a, this is wrong, we need to do better kind of conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wow, that really resonates. I mean, that really resonates with me. I mean, I've been a long time classroom teacher and school administrator and at the district office, and it is who I am. Like I'm a teacher. I still say
Yeah.
I'm a teacher. Even now at Branching Minds, it is who I am. And so we can see how that really impacts people when they're looking at an MTSS self-assessment by name. I'm assessing this work that I'm doing, and oh my gosh, I'm not doing the best, or I'm not committed here, or something that might be my challenge. But really it's about having that growth mindset to apply it to the work. You said something else that just made me think about, sometimes it may not be a fear, but what about just misunderstanding, right? Like we have transitioned from discrepancy models throughout history to RTI to MTSS, and we have the MTSS self-assessment. And there's just, I do still hear mixed language and conflation of a lot of these terms and stuff like that. Do you ever think that some of the fear is just actually not fear, and it may be misunderstanding?
Oh yeah, I certainly think so. Language allows us to get on the same page about things, to talk about concepts, to again, to do all of that kind of planning that we talked about and so on. And when we're using the same terms, but either not understanding what they mean, or we're using them and I mean something like A and you mean something like B, it ends up creating a lot of confusion and frustration. And that's the other thing about the terms and language you use. They change over time, right? As we learn more and know more. But then there's this idea of like diffusion. How do you, when you're making a shift as, say, a district or a school leader in the language you're using, remember that just saying, hey, we're calling this MTSS now, it was RTI before, that you have to create the space and time for folks to make sense of that and understand how it's similar and how it's different, so that we don't feed into that phenomenon we're all familiar with, that this too shall pass. Because let's face it, as educators, I think we've gotten used to new initiatives coming down the pike. And if you kind of wait long enough, whatever it is that we were told to work on this year is going to go away. And that hasn't happened with MTSS. But for many people, I think it has, because it was RTI and then it was MTSS. And then I know some districts are now calling it something different. So simply just changing the terminology doesn't reset. All of those experiences are still there, and we have to acknowledge and help people make sense of it.
Yeah. And this one isn't going away, right? Like this is evolving over time. Like you said, we're getting smarter, we're getting better at how we support students' needs in the classroom, which are so diverse, right? And I don't see this one being one that you can wait out, right? It's like, I'm not waiting this one out by the pool. No.
Yeah.
All right. So those are some of the fears. We understand what the self-assessment is. Why are we here today? We're here because we need to get over that hurdle, right? It is so important. It is so lovely when you walk into a classroom and students are using rubrics to self-reflect on their progress, that we're looking at growth over the whole school year for our students. We as educators have been shifting our mindset and working on that with our students. And so how do we get to this space as educators now and do that in our own work? How can we change our mindset about MTSS self-assessments? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a couple. I think first and foremost, we have to work on what MTS is and why we're doing it. Going back to the kind of question you kicked off our conversation with, there are still a lot of folks who think about MTSS as a process with a start and end that is designed to identify students as eligible or not for special education services. So in other words, it's part of an evaluation, comprehensive evaluation for special ed services. And it starts when you have a concern and stops once you make that eligibility determination. When we view MTSS that way, I think it's much more difficult to wrap our heads around why we do this self-assessment, because we're thinking, all right, well, we just got to get our processes right. We've got to make sure that we understand what we have to do to get that evaluation and to provide the evidence whether a student's ineligible or not, and we're done. So it seems much more simple when you think about it that way. Now, anybody who's been frustrated that they haven't been able to sort of cut through the hoops in order to determine you get an evaluation probably disagreed with what I just said. But I think that when you have that mindset, it's easier to get frustrated by that. And we're sort of missing the boat regarding what I said earlier, that this is a framework for an improvement. Yeah. And if you are doing all of the assessment, instruction, intervention, and decision-making practices are part of your MTSS, if you suspect a student may have a disability, much of what you need for that evaluation is occurring naturally as part of your system. And to me, that's an easier conversation to have about why we need to build this or self-assess this framework as we're building it. It's about improving outcomes, and it helps with our eligibility rather than we got to figure out how to get students eligible, for special education.
Gosh, Jose, I just want to pause. Yep. I think you need to say that whole sentence double time. I just want to grab that one and pull it out for a minute about not ensuring that it is the self-assessment is about all the practices that you do, and those practices will support you in this one challenge that you're having, right? With student identification for special education, not the other way around, right? Not that we need to solve this challenge of student identification, so we're going to do this multi-tiered system of support thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I
no,
just,
absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if I can repeat what I said, but I'm going to do my best here, which is, yeah, it's huge. And to add on to that idea that it's about instruction, it's about intensifying instruction using data to improve outcomes, first and foremost. What I think ironically sort of helps people with that idea is when we say things like, okay, so you found a student eligible, now what?
right.
And folks report things like they actually get less support to students with disabilities than students were getting, prior to being found eligible. And when we raise the point that students with disabilities are served at every tier of your MTSS, it's not just at the tippy top of the triangle. That's often an aha moment that can, blow some folks' minds, because the mindset often has been, it starts when you have a concern, it ends when you have eligibility, rather than we have a moral and a legal responsibility to improve outcomes for students with disabilities so that they can meet grade level standards. And our MTSS at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 needs to include supports for our students with disabilities. And I think that thinking about it that way, if you get it for students with disabilities, you get it for all students, and that it's a growth model, not a eligibility only. It contributes to eligibility. Don't get me wrong; it's important. It is important to identify students, but it's not the primary purpose.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that deeply about that sentiment. I think special ed and MTSS, that's a mindset shift, or what MTS is, or when does it start? And that self-assessment really helps you pull it back to this proactive model, right? Because the self-assessment talks about your assessment practices and identifying problem solving at tier 1. What do all of your students need? What are the general needs across your campuses, and those patterns too? And so key to the self-assessment. You mentioned Rome earlier, and I almost giggled. If I had my lemonade by the pool here, I would have spit it out because you talked about, getting people, building Rome and getting people point A to point B. And we talk a lot about like the mindset of infrastructure as well. Like, so just getting people and processes set up to do things, the checklist, the list that we send out, doesn't help you get the roadway set up and created, right? Like getting from point A to point B, everyone could be taking a different direction. It might be super hard because you're taking the wrong direction, might be bumpy, but when you really set up that infrastructure and build the systems and the pathways for everyone to follow, it does become more streamlined. It doesn't happen overnight. I think you and I have both lived that experience, as well as probably all the educators on the call today experience that length of time that it takes to really set up a strong MTSS infrastructure, but it's nearly impossible to get there without having a roadmap, right? Like an MTSS self-assessment. And that's MTSS self-assessment, whatever any state wants to call it, right? Like a lot of states have adopted various self-assessments. We use a roots report at Branching Minds, whatever you call it. The reality is it's not so much an assessment as it is like this is your roadmap to what to do next. These are your blueprints here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to me, it's a perfect parallel. Why do we assess what our students are learning? So we know where we're at, and to inform what we do next, instruction, intervention, et cetera. It's the same idea with a self-assessment. You move forward with the best laid plans of mice and men, and then you have to adjust. And that self-assessment helps you. Where do I look to see where I'm doing, and whether the different parts of what I need to do, and then how do I know how well we're doing so that we can then adjust along the way.
Yeah. It's you said we've talked about vocabulary, we've talked about Rome, we've run the gamut in this conversation, but I mean, the self-assessment of MTSS in my mind and how it's been explained to me as an educator, because I drank the Kool-Aid too. I drank the pool Kool-Aid for MTSS. It is your strategic plan. It is your whole system.
Mm,
It's literally how we educate our students from day one. Um, so I'm on the MTSS boat. The tool is a learning tool. Every time I read it, I uncover something that I'm like, oh, I just need to know more about how to do this, or what is this, or why is this so hard to do, right? If I started at the top line, number 3, and I only ever read that in the rubric, I feel like I'm missing so much without reading the whole. I like to start at 1. Like, do we have all
yeah.
of these little bullets? Do we have all of these little bullets, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you mentioning learning is critical, because I think that a lot of the sites that I've seen be successful with whatever, self-assessment tool they're using, often will embed it as part of their professional learning, whether that's training that they're participating in, over a few days spread out across the year, or at once, say in the summer at the beginning of the school year, or they'll embed it into their PLCs for the year, with an emphasis on learning about um, MTSS and planning for what we're going to do next. And the reason that I'm giving those examples is we were talking about time earlier, and uh, and I guess the beauty or the curse of time is we have about as much time as we're going to get in our schools. There's not, there are probably ways to get, more, but I don't think they're always like realistic, right? We tend to be set with the amount of time that we have. I think that's sort of the difficulty with time. The good thing is that we have some choice in how we use it. Yes, there are requirements. Yes, there are things that we have to do.
Mhm.
But that's where leadership comes in, is to determine how do we use the time we have as effectively as possible, and how do we facilitate connections and build things into things that we have going on, so that we're not overwhelming the folks that are doing the planning and learning about MTSS, but rather are helping build those opportunities for learning, conversations, growth, and planning into our structures. So that's why that example of whether it's PLCs or training often is successful. What I've seen that on the flip side that can be a challenge is when a mandate to do those comes down from,
Yeah.
from somewhere, and folks are trying to figure out where they're going to fit in the time to do it without the background and understanding that's built into some of those learning structures. You can kind of get malicious compliance or paper compliance, where folks will complete it, but the conversations aren't happening. If they are, they're not meaningful, and then nothing happens with the data that's completed. So going back to your original point, that idea of learning, just wanted to share one strategy that I've seen be successful in a lot of places, is building it into your professional learning. So it truly is a learning opportunity, not just like an accountability or mandate type of thing.
Yeah. 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 Let's talk more about strategies. So there's one, building it into learning. And so principals at the school level can do that, right, with their school teams about how they learn more about MTSS structures. And districts, I think there's likely a lot of district leaders on the call too, ensuring that their principals have a space, right, to have that in their learning environment too. But what else? What are the other tools, tricks, strategies um, for districts to help schools do this, for schools to help their teams implement self-assessments better?
No, that's a great question. I think it starts with your structure. We've both been talking about leadership and leadership teams. I've used that term a lot, and it doesn't have to be a new team you create for MTSS. It could be your whatever your leadership team is that deals with school-wide, assessment, structural
Problem
intervention
solving.
issues.
Yeah.
Exactly. So whatever that team is, making sure that that team's identified, that there's time for meetings and conversations, Sometimes it's before school, sometimes it's after school, sometimes it's during school. It just depends on who's on the team, the way the calendar sets up, all of those types of things. But if you have that structure, you've gotten to a point with your team where the folks on that team understand maybe not everything because it's learning about MTSS, but have the big picture, are committed, are working towards a vision and helping others to understand and realize that vision. If you have that structure, understanding the compelling why behind an MTSS self-assessment and using some of that time periodically to complete. And often it's once a year that folks will do this. Occasionally you might see it twice a year, depending on the tool. But there's ways to build it in there as well. So that's another strategy I've seen is really, leveraging those teaming processes, but you've got to have the time set up. There has to be time to do it, and it has to be honored, on a regular basis. You think about what?
Well, you mentioned time of year. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
no, you ask about time of year.
You go.
You mentioned that it typically happens once a year. I'm thinking about students in the classroom. I'm thinking about my best moments with a self-assessment, and it was really understanding at first, and then like going and doing some of the work and then coming back. If you're doing it at the end of the year, you're reflecting on you didn't maybe have those same standards, right? So how do you encourage leaders maybe not to fill out the whole self-assessment, but at least get comfortable with it before they would assess themselves against that rubric?
So I've seen people handle that a lot of different ways. And let me know whether I'm answering your question or if I'm just taking us down a rabbit hole you need to pull me out of real quick, because I could do that.
All right.
In terms of the timing part, like I've seen people do the beginning of the year, middle year, end of the year. And often I think what drives that are, if it's embedded in that professional learning, when those are occurring, if it's, or when there's just more time to sit down and focus on it based on what's happening throughout the school year. When folks are on or off contract, of course, plays a role in that as well. And I don't know, to be honest with you, if there's like a best way, to do that and think about it. I think that first and foremost, finding protected time to do it and have the conversations is probably the most important thing. The idea of doing it at the beginning of the year, when you've come back, you've got students sort of started it into the routine, you've been able to sort of catch your breath and take stock of things a few weeks in, and folks are getting a sense of how things are working. There may be some benefit to that, right? At the end of the year, you've been going a whole year, you're sort of winding things down, and then you're going to go into the period where you're going to plan for the next school year. There's some logic in that too, right? You can do some resetting, do some planning, and hopefully get some things in place for the next school year. Because not that everybody's on contract, but we all know a lot of school level and district level administrators are doing a lot of their planning during the summer, and often times the other folks on the leadership teams will be a part of that in some way, shape, or form. That varies by school district. So I'm not sure, what's better. I think you have to look at kind of your unique context. The last thing I'll say about that, and then you can tell me whether I get anywhere in the ballpark of what you were asking about, is another strategy I've seen people do, and I think there's pros and cons to this, is you mentioned breaking up a little bit the self-assessment. If you don't have a couple hour block, and sometimes it can be done, we've seen like in an hour, sometimes two ish, folks will break it up and really dive deeply into one section, and spend time having those conversations. Say, what have we learned from this? What's one step we can take? And then maybe in the next time we come together, we'll think about the next section. So for example, what is the leadership team going to do is often one section in a self-assessment. And then we can look at infrastructure in another one. And then another one will be our tiers of instruction and intervention. So breaking it up that way so that we can have focused and in-depth conversations rather than trying to rush through the whole thing. So again, I can't say that one is better than the other, but I think whatever you do, being creative is better than not doing it at all.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. This has been, I mean, super insightful. Jose, are there any other last strategies, district, school principal, just tips or tricks of the trade that you want to leave us with before we close out our little poolside chat here?
I do. I have one more.
Okay.
And I don't think we've said this explicitly, but you've heard us say, at least I've heard us say, Brittany, a bunch of times, like leadership team, a group effort to complete it, having conversations.
I'm so glad you remembered to make us say this. Yes.
Yeah. No, thank you. And so those conversations are, again, really important because you're bringing different perspectives together. You're building a more shared understanding. You're helping get people more on the same page. But we all know those conversations can also be challenging or difficult because there are people with strong opinions, that are people that think that something really needs to happen a certain way, or that based on their role and responsibility are really worried about a part of your MTSS, whereas somebody else might be worried about a very different thing. And I've seen too many of these self-assessment conversations get bogged down in people disagreeing or not talking about the same thing. So my final thing is, I think it's really important to have somebody with good facilitation skills lead the conversation. Somebody who can hear other people, can help make connections between where there are shared perspectives and experiences and where there are differences, and has the skills to help people navigate how to move forward when we don't have total agreement. Because otherwise you can spend a lot of time talking about these things and leave a meeting really frustrated because not a darn thing was accomplished. So, and there are opportunities with some self-assessments to get some, training and support in how you facilitate them as well.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I remember in my former role as a district administrator that we often came in as nonpartisan, we're here to support you and facilitate this, but really weren't a part of the workings of the school. So it didn't have so much like question as to what are you doing? It didn't elicit as much fear, and it really helped bring up some of those conversations that could potentially be stifled or scary or just kept everyone on track. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. As our teams kind of rest and recharge now for the summer, I was so thankful that we got to have this conversation now. I think it's a really good time for districts and schools to start thinking about MTSS self-assessment, MTSS practices for next school year. It's been such a pleasure talking with you, Jose. As always, we never get enough time to spend together. One of my favorite people to talk about MTSS with. But I hope that you and your family and all of the educators on this today or at our learning retreat today can take the summer to rest, recharge, reflect on your MTSS practices and school and our mindset, and just come back more deeply and ready to more deeply engage in our MTSS thinking and learning and taking action.
Yeah, no, of course.
Thanks for that.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you, Brittany. It was good to see you, and thank you to everybody who was a part of our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Jose.
Oh, I was muted. Rookie mistake. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Dr. Castillo. We appreciate you letting us listen in on your conversation this morning. And hello to everyone who is still joining us. My name is Maureen. I am on the marketing team here at Branching Minds, and I wanted to hop on to go over just a few logistical items. I know I am cutting into your break, so I will try to go quickly. Wanted to just give you all an idea of what to expect for the rest of the day. I see all of your thank yous pouring in to Britt and Dr. Castillo. Thank you. We feel those. Thank you. Thank you. So coming up next, we have right now about a 10-minute break, and then we will reconvene at noon Eastern time for our 90-minute workshop. That workshop will be on Zoom. You'll notice that we're switching between platforms today. So we're starting here on YouTube. We're going to do our workshop as a Zoom meeting because that will allow it to be more interactive and engaging. And then you'll have a 15-minute break after that workshop, and we'll reconvene at 1:45 Eastern back on YouTube to do our MTSS platform session deep dive. So we look forward to seeing you in the next few minutes. I want to reiterate what Britt said at the beginning, that tomorrow morning, all registrants will receive a follow-up email with recordings, slides, and resources. So if you miss something, you want to come back to it, all of that information will be sent to you via email. Attendees of the full retreat will also receive a certificate of attendance. So that is all for now. Please go enjoy a quick break, and we will see you back in about 9 minutes in the Zoom meeting that you should have received both via email and via calendar invite. So thank you so much, everyone. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon.